Freedom Radio.
Stories behind the bowl. You know, this is a series that we're doing, an ongoing installment of critical analysis of this Super Bowl game, but the people, the places, and the things behind it. And we're here with a special guest. He's familiar to the Freedom Radio listening audience. We just did a outstanding 4-piece series with this gentleman about his book, Midnight Basketball. I'll let him introduce himself to the listening audience, but I'm sure you're familiar with him.
Doug Hartmann. I work over at the U in University of Minnesota in the sociology department, do a lot of work on race and sports, and long-time connections here with Ralph and this crowd. So it's fun to be here. I appreciate it.
Okay. So, Doug, just off the top, I mean, without asking any questions, what is your observation in this city so far? This is 2018. Obviously, the Super Bowl is creating a lot of activity in the city. What are some of your observations on the atmosphere and what you're seeing, at least from your perspective?
Couple quick things. I think there's a lot of civic pride and stuff like that. People are out enjoying it. I've been interviewed a lot about the economic impacts. I think that's way more mixed, and some people are feeling it, and other people are really left out. And then the other thing is, I'm doing a lot of these little interviews about our town hosting. First question they want to know is, how cold is it today? I'm like, hey, if you need the weatherman, you should call somebody else, because we want to talk about some of these social issues. And I think that's part of what you're really interested in, is how, you focus on the pageantry, on all the positive things, and there's like an undercurrent and an underside that we want to be talking about. And it's harder to get people to want to talk about that. Even the economic stuff, they want to focus on the positives, and there are positives, but there's people who are left out. There's other things that we forget about. So that's, I think it's great for a lot of intangible reasons. But there's other things too, and it's hard to get those in the conversation, which is understandable, because people are focused on the game, or people here in the cities want us to look good, right? They want to celebrate the hosting. But that's why I'm so excited to be here, kind of talk about some of the broader issues that are surrounding sports in general, as well as hosting these big mega events. Mm-hmm.
And for the listening audience, again, Doug, familiarize us specifically, because you have a certain field of study, a certain expertise that's been earned through your scholarship. What exactly is your focus in terms of your specialty and what you teach at the U?
So in particular, I study a lot of issues around society and sports and society. I don't really study sports per se. Like, it's not how can the Timberwolves win their next game, but it's about how do sports and professional teams and local athletics, how do they fit into the larger fabric of communities, and what are some of the social issues around that we can see in society that come out through sports. As you know, we talked about with the Midnight Basketball book, a lot of that for me is about race stuff, race relations, racial attitudes, and sometimes I get accused of really not studying sports, but studying everything around sports, and I don't think that's a bad accusation. I mean, that's the point. Like, for me, I do a lot of work on race and racism, and how sports is actually a site not just always of opportunities for people of color, but sports as we consume them in the media, how it ends up also reinforcing some really bad stereotypes, putting people in boxes. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from on all this, as we're talking about sports, race, and the media. But the big picture for me, I study sports and its relationship to the rest of society, and try to draw people into thinking about larger social issues, often starting from something they really love and celebrate, but haven't thought about so critically.
Well, yes, and let's talk about that critical thought. So you mentioned some of our theme, what we're talking here today, race, sports, and media, but also we're dealing with ownership. What is ownership in the context of sports, and how does that play out in terms of the impact on the broader society? Maybe from a more direct look at the impact on black athletes and the black community, the idea of ownership. What does that really mean? Yeah,
ownership, who owns it? Who's in charge? Who gets to control things, and who benefits from that? And the reality of some of our many of our biggest professional leagues where African American athletes are most successful, is that they actually don't own the leagues. They don't have near the control of it or get the profits. And it's mostly the ownership is, a lot of rich white guys. And so for me, there's two things about that. One is it's kind of a weird thing for a lot of regular folks of us, because a lot of people focus on how many millions the players are making. Right. But really, we could be talking about how many billions the owners are making. But then that's a weird struggle, because it's billionaires versus millionaires, which leaves a lot of us out in the cold. But it is about thinking about that relationship. I guess one of my starting points for this, I think of that William Roden, the New York sports writer who wrote that book, $40 Million Slaves. Mm-hmm. And that to me probably gets to some of these themes is, yeah, there's a lot of black athletes who are successful in football and basketball and who made millions, but they're still under the control, under the thumb of a majority white ownership. And they're controlling how the league operates, what images are out there, how it's portrayed in advertising, but also then just who benefits, who gets, the rewards, like from hosting a Super Bowl, all the profits that's going to come into the city. Who gets that?
Let me ask you a question with that. Is the sports model of ownership a prototype, a commercial prototype of just society in general? Like, sports is an escapism for many people, but it's funny, like sometimes when you try to escape things, you're actually very much caught into them, psychologically. So, is there some kind of like master plan, that you maybe studied historically on this whole sports model and ownership and the role of sports on broader society, just to kind of, create a simulation of what society is actually based on?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's the kind of thing I try to get everybody to think about in my classes. I often will start by talking, I think this is a little bit connected with the language you use, and sport is a microcosm of larger economic processes and practices, and especially how capitalistic we are and big monopolies. I mean, people with lots of money run things and run the show, and our sports kind of looks like that, right? It's big, rich folks who are the owners who control things and make the profits. Now, what's interesting about that for me, where it's a little different than just a reflection of living in a capitalist society, is how, as a society, in terms of laws and policies, we've actually made it even more like that by giving owners like antitrust exemptions, whether it's for baseball or the NFL, and special tax breaks for building their stadiums or buying the land that they need. And so that's what's, I would say, a lot of the economic dynamics of ownership and workers in sports is a lot like others, but we've actually made it even more intensively focused and concentrated the economics, because we act like sports is something different. So we create these antitrust exemptions and things like that allow sport to be even more operate like its own little monopoly around the NFL, or even like the NCAA. They get to set the rules for all the students who are playing, and who gets the profit and the benefit of that. It's the big universities, and they do that because we've created laws that give them that freedom to run that, and that's not always been for the benefit of the athletes themselves. And that's, like right now, like, shouldn't we be giving something back? Whether it's the Final Four or the national championship of football, especially these are the sports where a lot of black athletes are excelling, bringing lots of attention, but they don't get much back. So that's an economic thing, right? And I think you're right. That reflects kind of a lot of the capitalist economics of our society, but it's even accentuated because really we kind of act like it's not like that. We give them their own, like, this is something special. Right. They get a special status. They don't get taxed the same way. They don't get regulated the same way as a lot of other businesses. So that might be, is that going too deep maybe? But that's
No, you're good. But yeah. And even on top of that, how do you feel, what if we didn't have sports? What would society actually look like? Because it would strip down that particular relationship that we have as sharing interest in the collective team. You know what I'm saying? So if we did not have this collective team identity, whether that be the Vikings or the Philadelphia Eagles or whoever the team may be, how would we really interface with each other in terms of the value system that would take place?
Well, that's probably hard for a lot of us to imagine because it's such a big part of our lives. But to me, I'd probably say it's not so much what if we didn't have sports, but what if we didn't have professional sports like we have them now? Mm-hmm. And that, some other models we might think about, it could be like cities would own teams, not owners. So it'd be more like a public good. Or it could be more of a kind of another model is like in a lot of the European football, like soccer, how that started was companies. It was company teams. Mm-hmm. So it was like an extension of the company. So those are different. Or even like if you think about sport in communist countries, it was like, the government ran sports, and not even from a professional point of view, but for developing like youth, physical activity opportunities, as well as Olympic champions. So it's really, I think, to me, it's not so much sports or no sports, but different ways that we would organize the sports that are in our societies. Because it's hard for me to imagine a world where people don't want to play games and use their bodies and compete, but it's the kind of context that we do that in, and we've made it like really professionalized and capitalistic in the communities we live in.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to take this break. I'm going to ask one question. We're going to take a quick break. Tell me a real quick answer, and then I want you to kind of like, deal with it after the break. But can we start making a comparison in terms of the revolutionary stand that happened like maybe in the 68 Olympics with Muhammad Ali? Can we start to add LeVar Ball's name to that in comparison in terms of potential impact on the people, the way the minds of the people think in terms of standing against a system, an exploitive system, but exerting their power within that to potentially build some things? Is LeVar Ball, is he entering in that category?
I'm not sure about him. I'll think about it over the break. I'm curious what your thoughts are. I think, to me, the person that's more relevant that I'd be thinking about is more Colin Kaepernick. Okay. And that's a little less optimistic because I think he was pushing that direction, and look what happened to him, how he got kind of squeezed. But let's talk about that.
Yeah, real quick, quick though. But Kaepernick wants people to take a knee. LeVar Ball wants you to be an owner.
Right. And that's what both of them we'll talk about. Okay. What I'm saying is Kaepernick wanted to do that, and look what the owners did to him.
Okay. So, yeah, we'll be right back after this break. This is getting interesting.
Yo, V, bring the beat in. Yeah, that's all right.
All right, check it out. Here we go.
So this will be the second part for our interview thing, and we're getting into some real meat now, Doug. Now I'm telling you straight up and down, I think, in my opinion, LeVar Ball is making the kind of revolutionary impact on the minds, specifically of the youth, of new possibility, of a new way to exert your talent, gift, skill, and to claim ownership within a space of exploitation. And of course, this is a generational kind of next move of that. You can also kind of see the influences of his thinking with the great ones. Like, you wouldn't have a LeVar Ball without a Muhammad Ali. I mean, clearly, you know what I'm saying? You can see that coming through, especially in his age. I think he's like 50 years old or something like that. All those cultural influences of the youth of that generation are now pushing limits forward for this generation. And so my thought is that LeVar Ball, in comparison to Kaepernick, is kind of, I think popular thought would embrace Kaepernick because it brings people and it attracts people to a certain stand, but tangibly, what does that do in the sense of ownership and creating more opportunity? I don't know how you feel about that, but I mean, why don't you go ahead and expand on your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's got me thinking now. When I mentioned Kaepernick, I think you're right. It's hard to see the concrete, like what's going to change because of what he's doing. And I think that's really interesting, whether it's Ball or who other people would be kind of what the next direction of new kinds of sports institutions, new kinds of ownership. I want to talk about that a little more. I'll say though, why I mentioned Kaepernick is because I think he stands as a symbol of how scary change is and how he got then kind of tramped down and controlled and taken out by the structures what are in place. So to me, it's not that I think he's necessarily so much a symbol of future change, like I think you think, and I want to talk about with Ball, but it's more of how hard that's going to be because he's a pretty good quarterback, and you would have thought he would have had some kind of market for his skills, and he didn't get it. I mean, I don't know if it's specifically collusion in a legal sense, but clearly they didn't want him around. And so that to me is a sign of how the power of the current ownership structure and system. So how hard it's going to be to find people who are really able to resist and change that. That's just where and that's why I'm super interested to hear more where the possibilities for resistance and real change are. I guess the only other thing I'd say about before I hadn't even thought about individuals that represent that is how hard that changes, but then how hard it is, especially working within the economic structures, what are in place. Because from the media to the stadiums to the league ownerships, like how you break into that's going to be hard.
Well, let me ask you this: as one who studies, does research, quantitative research, correct, and looks at these issues of sports, race, and how they interface in society. I would think that Lavar Ball is definitely a worthy case study of to look at deeper. And the thing that why I put this out here is because Kaepernick basically got fired. All right, you work a job, man, we're firing you. Point blank. You're not going to do this. Period. Popular stand of players that formed around him. Kind of took gestures to keep it going, but as you know, it seemed like the players' union almost sold him out for some money, within the system. Lavar Ball, created his own pathway and forced the system to change through economics and his ability to position his skill, talent, and gift of communication and packaging his ownership of his children to do something that has not been done before in sports. So I think as time goes on, it's going to be very interesting because the dominant society has done a media hit job on Lavar Ball, obviously. But he continues to change the dynamic of what's possible within the world of sports and within the world of commerce and within the world of possibility. So I think that I want to ask you a question. Do you feel that in the field of academia, do people like yourself and systems like that study these things, do they take a Kaepernick more seriously than Lavar Ball? Has Lavar Ball been made almost like a sideshow where you can't even see the seriousness of what he's actually doing?
I think you just convinced me yes. Okay. We haven't taken him serious enough. It's really making me think. And I think part of it, it's easy to kind of we like to look at the protests and the heroic figures or the tragic figures, and Kaepernick kind of represents that. But I think I'm really starting to think you're right. I need to look more seriously, me or others, at Ball and kind of where he's trying to position himself and the kind of implications for how we think about sports and everything. The thing what I would really hook on to, what you said embedded there is really about youth sports. I'm a little skeptical of how he's using his kids, in a sense, to build this new vision and empire. But I would say more generally where I think there's real potential for real institutional and structural change is more around youth sports, grassroots stuff, recreational sports, fitness. And that's to me goes back to what you and your crowd was trying to do in the 90s with high school sports or with the Ghetto Basketball Association and everything. It's not just about the professional leagues where ownership is everything and it is all about profits. It's a lot more also about identity and community, style, all those kind of things. So that's to me, if you're going to convince me to start studying Ball and others like him, I'm not Well, I'll look at the economic ownership stuff, but I'm real interested in what's that impact on the ground and how's what he's trying to do connect with those communities, the new kids coming up, the masses of new kids coming up, most of whom aren't going to be superstar athletes, but it's how sports works in their lives and what could be different than the models we got right now. Okay,
Doug, I just had a vision. I think we might have to make this happen because I know that it would have huge impact. We might have to get Lavar Ball out here to speak to students at the U and broader community because, again, I know that just like you used in reference for the listening audience, a league here locally that was called a GBA, pioneering in many ways, but on a whole different level, what I see happening with how he's moving the culture, and we're talking culture now. We're not, there's all kinds of, subsets of culture, but when he's pushing culture forward and he's definitely making huge waves, and I think it's worthy of those who study the impact of movement to look really deeper into this dude, man, because he's doing some phenomenal stuff. But we'll leave it at that with Lavar Ball.
I'm in on it, though. Okay, if you get in here, let's do that. Yeah. And just one of the, I think what he's doing, at least how you're characterizing and describing it, is really different than even, notable things that are laudatory but problem, like how baseball tries to do the RBI leagues or how the NFL tries to build little stadiums. He's doing something different. Mm-hmm. If that's true, I want to hear more about it and even be part of that conversation. If you can get him here, that'd be awesome.
Okay. We'll try to do that. So, Doug, let's say we're looking outside. We're downtown Minneapolis. It's snowing. It's crazy cold at night. People are trying to stand outside for concert venues in the cold with no jackets on. Culturally speaking, this might be a fantasy world for some. For others, it's actually just a crazy experience of resilience. So I want to know, what are your predictions as we move forward after the Super Bowl? How is this, if anything, going to have impact on the black athletes that participate and the communities that they represent, and maybe looking at that from a local perspective, you know what I'm saying? Micro, macro, like the big game is what it is, but how is the big game going to have any impact with all this commerce and all this money that's being spent in this city that identifies itself at times of being inclusive, but we know kind of there's another story to that. How is this going to move forward after the game is over?
Well, I don't know that the game itself is going to change a lot of things you and I have talked about a lot of times. I think it's almost peripheral to that. Or even worse, maybe that, like things like the Super Bowl reinforce the capitalist system of most professional sports, reinforce a lot of the ways that a lot of the problems that we would see around sports. So I don't know that the Super Bowl is going to change that. In fact, if anything, it reinforces it. And it kind of encourages us as we get caught up especially here in Minneapolis, caught up in the civic pride of hosting the event. It almost blinds us to some of those things that are actually not so great about pro sports. To me, one of the things I see most encouraging is how many little activist groups and organizing is happening around the context of the Super Bowl. And there's been a bunch on campus, whether it's about police brutality and racism or about human trafficking, about homelessness. I think one of the things I see that's potentially progressive is how people, not just in sports but around sports, are seeing that sports is actually a venue, not just that has a lot of problems in it, but presents some possibilities for organizing and trying to create some broader consciousness that might not exist. So if we're talking about trying to think about some of the best things that could come out of it, that's to me really exciting to see how young people are starting to see they don't just have to, they might not like the Super Bowl or NFL, but they can engage that venue, this event, to talk about broader social issues. And it could be about protest, or it could just be about calling attention to things. That's pretty amazing. I've seen young people talking about that. Some, college athletes, more kind of Division III level, but what they see the sports means in their lives and how they can use that to contribute for them to give back to the society. That's to me where there's some potential real positive future energy that could come out.
Okay. And lastly, man, we know that you're an internationally known cultural critique around these kind of issues. Why don't you direct the audience to some either some written material or some visual material that you're featured in for those who want to access some more of your thoughts on this conversation and otherwise?
If y'all are interested at all in some of the stuff I said, the website that I do, the societypages.org, and that's about all kinds of sociology stuff, but that's over the last couple of years. I mean, I'll have a piece I've written about sports and race, so you can find some of that there. I've been really trying to track and write something every couple of months or so about this emerging wave of activism and protest in and around sports. I think it's something like we haven't seen since the late 1960s. So if you go to that site, that's where you'll see some of the stuff I've written. We just have a new piece up. I wrote it with my guys. Give them a shout out, Kyle and Alex. Kyle Green, Alex Manning, we wrote a piece about the NFL protests and kind of what some of the lessons you can take from that are. So that'd be one example, but dig a little deeper in there, and I've written a number of things recently about that. It also have links to my book on the 1968 protests and the Midnight Basketball book that you and I talked about last time.
And also, I'm familiar. There was an actual BBC production that you were included in.
Oh yeah, the Fists of Freedom, I think it was. That was kind of a more documentary about 1968. I've been in a few things like that. There's a little documentary about Vikings fans a few years ago that I was one of the talking heads for. So yeah, there's a few little things like that, and I think I've got links to some of those on the website too. Okay, excellent. Man, we appreciate you coming in. I think we're going to have you as kind of like a special guest correspondent for different kind of issues, man. But we're live. This is Freedom Radio, and these are the stories behind the bowl. This is a audio documentary installment. Again, we're talking about the people, places, and things that are surrounding this big, huge event in this city. In the cold for the Super Bowl, and we'll be back.
Freedom Radio.